Okay. Welcome everybody to the Evidence Reasons Academy. I am privileged to be joined by Dr. David Snoke at the University of Pittsburgh, Distinguished Professor of Physics. He does some really cool things. He does stuff with quasi-particles, and I heard him talk about even a biological laser, which is just really cool. This is just so fascinating to me. These are areas of physics I didn't study. One thing that I found very compelling, though, is, and I read some of Dr. Snoke's background. He is a physicist, but he's also a Christian, and he's written an essay about God of the gaps, and also it's in this book a little bit. This was, I think, if I understood this correctly, this is actually going to be also possibly a textbook to study physics in high school. And if
it gets back in print, yeah.
If it gets back in print, and if I were as a Christian student, this is just marvelous to see someone who can talk about science and also about faith and miracles. And so I'm going to link in the video description below a link to that essay that Dr. Snoke wrote. And so since he's here, and he and I had like a long nerdy conversation before this recording started. We were talking about statistical mechanics. You can imagine what kind of conversation that was. But now we're going to talk about his essay. So Dr. Snoke, I'll just start with a question. What motivated you to write that essay?
On the God of the gaps.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so it's interesting. So back in the 90s, there was a lot of discussion going on among sort of Christians in science about really how to even think about arguments for the existence of God. And there's a certain section of Christians who would really kind of argue that you should really never make any arguments for the existence of God. One of their, arguments is that, well, if you make an argument for the existence of God, that means somebody else can make an argument against the existence of God, and then where are you? And I'm kind of like, well, I'm willing to risk it. I think we need to be rational, but there's a whole lot that goes into that. Some people will simply say that you have to adopt a worldview, and if that worldview has God in it, you just run with it, and you don't ever argue, for the existence of that. There's a lot of things I could go into as why I think that's a very simplistic approach. But the bottom line is that, in fact, people do argue for and against the existence of God as to whether the existence of God makes sense or not. And so in that context, there were, there's sort of this lore of what people call the God of the gaps. And, essentially, when I say I'm arguing in favor of God of the gaps, I'm arguing for it in the sense that I mean, and not in the sense that they mean. So the sort of standard lore for God of the gaps that you'll hear, and I just, again, probably wrote the essay because I heard this so many times, and I'm like, that's not reality. Is this idea that historically, every time people simply saw something they didn't understand, they would say, oh, God did it. And that would count as an argument for the existence of God. And so now we have science. And so every time we explain something by science, that removes one of those arguments. And so therefore, the longer science goes, the less gaps there are to hide God in. And so if you have that kind of mode of argumentation, eventually you'll just run out of gaps to hide God in. So my reading, my background, was like that argument is wrong at many levels. The first thing that's wrong about it is simply it's not even true about history of how people actually argued. It is simply not the case that people said, oh, every time I don't understand something, that's an argument for the existence of God. If you look at people like, Augustine or Aquinas or even Plato and so on, they're arguing very sophisticated arguments, and typically they're arguing from origin of the universe, origin of life, and origin of consciousness. And they're not saying every comet is an argument for the existence of God. They're saying, there are these other things that are really crucial. And interestingly, all three of those that I mentioned are still where we're at today. Like those are still the big arguments. So what people, I think, were misinterpreting history was, it's often the case, if you're already a believer in God and you see something you don't understand, like a comet, that you might say, well, given the existence of God, I think that's some sign from God. But nobody was seriously arguing that because of comets, therefore God. I mean, that's never was argued by any intellectual in the Western history. But they often were interpreting things based on their pre-existing belief in the existence of God, and simply saying, well, maybe that's some miracle that God did, but they simply weren't arguing that way. So first of all, it's just a misunderstanding of history, because all the big questions that they base their arguments on are the same ones we're arguing now. Why is there consciousness? Why is there life? Why is there something rather than nothing? It's the same big philosophical questions that have always been. So in that context, then, the second thing that kind of came up was just thinking about how science works. And some people would say, well, you can't see God in the equations, so therefore you can't argue from God from anything is explained or not explained. And again, I think that actually doesn't understand how science works. A lot of times you have two rival theories, and they both are claiming to explain the same set of data. And then you say, well, which of these, makes the best overall explanation for what I'm seeing? And it's not as though either of those theories pops out of the data. You're generating really out of, your own thinking some, argument of what the explanation is. And then you're comparing it to the data and saying, does this agree or does it not? And actually, in every type of science, there's some data that doesn't agree with the theory. And so then that's what I'm calling a gap, right? And so most of scientific data, most of scientific debate is about, which theory has more gaps, which theory has the more things that it explains and the things that are unexplained. And so it's really common in physics for someone to say, well, I have this theory of electrons, and I think this spectral line that we're looking at is due to this particular theory of electron motion. And somebody else will say, that's just totally wrong. That doesn't work. Like if you actually run the equations, it doesn't predict the line anywhere where you say it is, and it's off by a factor of 10,000. And, if that person were to take the anti-God of the gaps position, they say, oh, that's just a gaps argument. You're just telling me about a gap in my theory, and that's an invalid type of argument. And you say, well, of course that's a gap in your theory. That's a totally legitimate type of scientific argument to say, your theory fails to explain this major phenomenon. And so when you think of it that way, it's totally legitimate to say your theory fails to explain this and my theory does. And you can come back at me if you want and say, yeah, but your theory doesn't explain this over there. And then we're debating about whose theory has more gaps. But in each case, gaps arguments are perfectly legitimate.
And I don't know if you'd feel comfortable saying this, but I would say it's also perfectly legitimate, not just gaps, but there comes a point I would say a theory's been actually falsified if they're claiming it as a mechanism. And
yeah, so
there's a point when I would actually abandon a theory.
Yeah, and it's actually, so there's another essay I have that I can send you actually, which was just published this last year on the title of it is How Does Anyone Change Their Mind About Anything? And it sort of is about how we assess theories and so on. And essentially, there is this sort of lore in philosophy of science that, one falsified experiment will destroy a theory. And actually, that's hardly ever the way that science works, because to do that, you would have to have absolute confidence that the experiment was done right. And that's almost never the case, right? So, in fact, what you can talk about is weight of evidence or burden of evidence. And so I would say that every theory of man has some gaps in it. And what happens is, as you proceed along and the gaps just keep piling up, and you're like, yet another thing this thing doesn't explain, you get this heap of things that make no sense. That's when you start to abandon a theory. It's not just one falsified thing, but typically you're saying like a whole bunch of things just are piled up, and that's when I'm going to change my viewpoint. And that can happen, in either direction for any theory.
So you mentioned in that paper, I just to in the interest of transparency, I haven't read the full paper, but there are certain key terms that I will just leap out at me. I think you mentioned like Darwinian evolution in your paper and intelligent design, and I think if I recall correctly, you said, well, it's fair game to criticize this theory on scientific grounds. At some point, how, at some point, when do we start considering that it's inaccurate, or at least something like that? And I thought that was really legitimate. I mean, for me personally, when I start hearing about multitude of experiments that, Darwin claimed that natural selection is what creates the complexity. His Origin of Species, chapter 6 says, organs of extreme perfection and complication. And he was talking about how natural selection would build it up. In like even just the last 10 years, plethora of experiments saying natural selection's deleting genes, deleting. And actually Eugene Koonin, in a paper, he built on that, and he kind of looked at kind of his historical reconstructions. He said the dominant mode of evolution is gene loss, punctuated by kind of these spurts, and he didn't explain why those spurts happened. And I'm just like, okay, so this feels to me like a big timeout. This didn't proceed from any religious inspiration. This is people who are probably, favorable to natural selection, just reporting their experimental results and observations. And all like this, me as an ID proponent, I was kind of thrilled about this, but if I weren't so biased, I'd still say, look, you can't run away from this. This is problematic. If it looks like complexity is actually anti-correlated with reproductive fitness, this is actually the exact opposite of what Darwin was saying. So if you wanted to comment, it was great seeing that in your essay, if that was also on your mind when you wrote it.
Yeah, well, I think one can distinguish between Darwinian evolution as a specific theory and materialism as a more overarching worldview. And so materialism, in some sense, is a philosophical position that you can just take regardless of the data, right? You can simply say like impersonal, undirected forces acting with randomness will generate everything that we see. And there's no need for any design. And you can define design as, forward-looking teleology, sort of aiming for something. And the alternative is impersonal things that just act, cause and effect with no intention of where they're going to go. So that materialistic worldview, I've talked to a number of people, and maybe even more so in the last 5 to 10 years, who are committed materialists who would say, well, Darwinian evolution is a failure. It just doesn't work on the merits, like it breaks down. But they will simply hold out and say, well, some version of materialism will replace it. Like it's a faith position, so to speak, where they're saying, well, it can't be God. So if Darwinism doesn't work, some other materialist, thing will pop up to replace it. And as I said, that's based on largely on a false conception of history, that like materialism has continued to win the day, for hundreds of years. And actually, as I said, all the big problems are no better solved now than they were, back when people were asking them in the Middle Ages. Yeah, and Darwinism, clearly, if it's going to be a scientific theory at all, it's on the table for positive and negative predictions of things that can be falsified. And certainly, I have, I guess I would say as a Christian, I have the freedom to believe it or not based on the evidence, whereas the materialist is biased toward it, because a materialist has to believe some materialist account, and Darwinian evolution is the best around so far, right? So I would say, I was sort of very open to it being more true than I now think, because the evidence has convinced me otherwise. I'm just like, even some of the most basic premises don't seem to stand up anymore.
So maybe in the closing 5 minutes, I'll just probe your paper with Michael Behe. At the time you and he wrote it, I didn't have my physics degree. I didn't have my biology degree. I didn't know any. I didn't know anything, and I still feel like I don't know anything. But I can go back and read it now with a different perspective. This was talking about the evolution, the difficulty of evolving a disulfide bridge, disulfide bond in a protein, and calculating the odds, and how one particular path of natural selection could evolve it. Now, my understanding is you actually had the opposite opinion, that it was probably feasible, and if I'm mischaracterizing this, you could straighten it out.
Yeah, well, so yeah, that's an interesting. So we used to have these online forums that were like, text only forums and everything. I was on one that Michael Behe was on, and he posted something that I thought was very strange, which was, in certain situations, if you make the population size 10 times bigger, the time to fix a new trait is not 10 times shorter. And I thought that just sounded really wrong. Like, how could that be the case? Because, it just seems like you got more chances. It should take less time. So I wrote to him, and he explained to me his numerical model. And so the first thing I did is I reproduced the numerical model. I'm like, you're right. You get the answer that he says. His code is right. So then I'm like, how could that be? And so then I came up with an analytical model that, just with a set of differential equations, in about 5 or 6 lines, you can prove his claim, basically, that it's sublinear, and the exponent is based on the number of parts that you need to put together. The argument's fairly simple, is that, if you need 6 parts, well, you have a population, some fraction of that population gets part 1, but now that population is a small fraction of the whole, right? Now only that population can get the second part, right? And so you keep reducing the population that has all of them, and especially if you account for, they can go back down, so they get part 1 but they can lose it, and so on. And you don't even have to have them in order. You could get them in random order, but you still end up with this diminishing returns. So I ended up writing the appendix to the paper, which is the mathematical appendix, and co-authored it. And what was interesting to me in the debate about it was, for me as a physicist, the total interest was in the power law, in the exponent, and not in the details of what particular molecule or pathway was being modeled. And nobody debated the mathematical appendix. Nobody said that that was incorrect. They're all debating the details of the coefficients of particular proteins, which was beyond my job description, and irrelevant in some sense to me, because if you've got sublinear growth in time to get to a new thing, that's just a killer. It doesn't matter what the coefficients are up front. If you're saying this thing progresses as time to the 1/10, like that's just killing anything. It doesn't matter, like what the coefficients in front of that factor are.
It makes it move. So then my understanding is in 2014, you also published with some other co-authors who I'm presuming are physicists too.
Yeah, so that was the sort of, in some sense, related as a follow-up, but trying to get away from the idea of an absolute fitness landscape and to have sort of the ability to have continuous upward growth of complexity. Because I think a lot of people, not just ID people, are saying it's too limiting to have some sort of rigid, static fitness landscape. And instead, you need sort of a figure of merit that can grow indefinitely. So working with that model, we did a population model where essentially we accounted for two things. One is the benefit of getting something new, but also the cost of making new things that are useless. So if you assume, again, like in the Behe paper, that if you need 10 parts to make something with real extra value, then you have to have a system that doesn't eliminate useless stuff right away. You have to have some tolerance for useless stuff floating around. And if that cost is too high, then you never get anything new, because, think about, like, if I had a third leg, all right, and it doesn't help me walk, like, it's just a net drag, all right. Well, if everybody in a population with a third leg immediately gets killed, like, you can never go on to anything more, right? So you need, for novelty in evolution, you need some tolerance of useless stuff. And historically, that's been the way they've argued in terms of like vestigial organs and, prehensile tails, and, like, you can have useless stuff. The problem we found is that there's sort of a trade-off. If you make the cost of it too high, you can't get anything new. But if you make the cost too low, then you can't get rid of it. And this connects to your own work, which is that weakly deleterious mutations basically just accumulate, and you can't get rid of them because they go through the whole population and then everybody has it. And so if you're making this extra stuff and it's only weakly deleterious, you end up with a body stuffed full of junk that you can't get rid of.
Well, the situation, okay, so Dr. Sanford wrote his thesis about that 2005. As he and I worked on the project, it's been modified. We see two phenomenon. One, you do accumulate lots of useless junk that's mildly, I call it function compromising. It's a better term, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
But the worst thing is there is a lot of loss of really valuable stuff. And what we realized is this is what they call loss of versatility. So if you're in an environment that really just specializes for one thing, it's going to tend to force gene loss. So so what I mean, this is kind of like proverbial. If you're going to be a specialist, you're no longer a generalist. So if you're really good at doing one thing, which is under high selective pressure, you're going to lose the ability to operate in other environments. And this can be, we're actually seeing this in laboratory experiments where they're really excited that they were able to evolve one feature really well. We're seeing huge trade-offs in losing what was actually useful. So the situation that you described plus the situation we described, they're not mutually exclusive, and we're actually seeing the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting. We haven't modeled that at all. So I did that work, like I said, about 10 years ago, set it aside, and have just now got a new team back together of people, including biologists, who are really interested in picking that up again. And as I was saying, I think part of that is because there's a new openness in biology of saying classic Darwinism may be wrong, even by people who are committed materialists, simply saying, well, we want to go where the evidence leads. And if this one doesn't work, we'll hold out for some other materialist view, but we're not going to cling to a theory that simply doesn't work. But yeah, there's some very significant problems of So I'll just say this, all the way back when the Behe paper came out, the premise of both that paper and the later one I did in Complexity, the premise is that it takes several things to make a useful machine, and that those individual things don't significantly benefit you along the way. A lot of the critique has been, oh no, you could have every single part give you a benefit along the way. And so you don't have to face this problem of carrying useless stuff because every part is useful. And to me, that is really a flight of fancy, because you're really saying that, like, you're going to build a sewing machine, but every part of that sewing machine is also going to be a useful tool before you ever assemble the sewing machine. So I mean, one could argue that, but you're essentially then getting into a statistical argument and then saying you've got these channels in parameter space where you can get to a useful machine passing only through other useful machines, and that every useful machine all the way down to the atomic level is built out of other machines that are also useful and give you a survival benefit. And that just defies belief.
Yes, not only does it defy belief, I would argue we're getting more and more experimental evidence to that effect.
That just doesn't match up. Yeah.
Yes. So we could talk for hours, and I was just so I wish we had recorded all our talk about thermodynamics and Landauer's theorem and statistical mechanics. The nerds out there would just love it. Maybe someday in the future we could talk. I'm hoping maybe also someday in the future I'll be able to collaborate on some of the biological and evolutionary things. I'm presently working on 3 papers simultaneously, trying to retire them, and maybe I'll be able to move on. So, Dr. Snoke, if you had any closing words.
Not especially, but great talking to you. And yeah, actually, I would love to resurrect that natural philosophy book. It was the history of that's kind of interesting, that it was kind of written for a Christian school homeschooling type students, where my assumption was most of them probably will not become physicists. And so I'm going to write about what's actually interesting philosophically and theologically in the physics world. What I found is that actually most of the Christian schools and homeschoolers are interested in passing the AP physics test and have no interest in philosophy at all.
Well, there's also, yeah.
So I know there's a huge interest in those schools to be validated by passing the AP tests, because that kind of validates that their education was legitimate. So I could talk about whether we need to do that, but I would say in some sense the book I wrote could be viewed as a supplement to a regular physics course, where you say, well, as you're doing the churning through the equations to pass this AP test, maybe consult, like, what's the philosophical, theological relevance of all of this, instead of just memorizing inclined planes.
Yes, that's okay. I just got to confess. That's when you feel that this is leading. I mean, I'm just speaking as me, personal. When somehow that my studies are connecting me with God, it ennobles it. So when I was studying math, and oh my goodness, the worst class I ever took was classical mechanics, Goldstein's mechanics. But it opens, that book opens, I thank thee, God, that you've given me all this wisdom. It was a quote from Daniel. I'm like, that was really amazing.
Yeah.
This book that just about killed all of us. Goldstein's mechanics. I don't know if you ever took that.
Yeah, no, I didn't study from that one, but I've known a lot of people who did. It's a good textbook. But yeah, it's sad actually that I feel like Christians ought to be the most interested in philosophy, but oftentimes it's not the case. Like, oftentimes they're the most nose to the grindstone, just memorize the equations and prove that you're smart. And it's a shame, because, like, Christianity is about the big picture and what's the wider world that we live in, and yet oftentimes it gets pushed aside just to sort of prove your credentials a lot of times.
Well, before I say goodbye, I'd like to let the viewers know there's also a book that I just recently purchased. Dr. Snoke has written a book on solid state physics. I presume it's used to teach
Much
graduate
different
classes.
levels. Yeah.
And I already looked, what I saw of it was just awesome. And I'm particularly interested in quasi-particles, and Dr. Snoke
Yeah.
did
That'll be
that.
another conversation
Yes,
sometime.
absolutely. So with that, I'm just going to close our show. Thank you all for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.